Thanks for listening to the Duval Rundown, brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Your path to recovery starts here. Now here's your host, Gus Logue.
Good morning and welcome to episode 39 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am every Thursday, by Mia O'Brien to break down the Jaguars' weekend matchup. This week they played the Tennessee Titans in Week 14 for their first game against what I thought was their biggest rival. Maybe not anymore after what happened in the past 7 days against the Texans. But yeah, definitely a big week, even if the Jaguars are technically eliminated from playoff contention. Doug Peterson was talking yesterday about how he's not worried at all about the team staying motivated through these last 5 games. But before we get into our little preview, we're going to do some Jaguars trivia. Brian Thomas Jr. is 1 touchdown away from breaking the franchise rookie record with 7 receiving touchdowns. Who held the franchise's rookie receiving touchdowns record before this year? Was it A, Justin Blackmon, B, Allen Hurns, or B, Allen Robinson, C, Allen Hurns, or D, Ronald McDonald? Mia, you got a guess for this one?
Ronald McDonald is truly the epitome of fake or real Jaguar, if you've ever played that game before, because it's actually, maybe it's because I just pulled up a bunch of stats about Ronald McCreary, or Roger McCreary with the Tennessee Titans. You're throwing me for a loop here. I'm going to go with B, Allen Robinson.
It's actually the other Allen, bro.
Oh,
Allen Hurns had 6 receiving touchdowns in his rookie year, which was 2014, I want to say. He was an undrafted free agent. And so Brian is currently tied with Allen Hurns with 6 receiving touchdowns on the year, but just 1 more and he'll break the franchise rookie record for that stat. And so definitely one reason to keep watching is young bucks like Brian Thomas Jr. continuing to do their thing. But instead of focusing on the offense today, we're focusing more on the defense, or really the Titans defense, because they brought in new coaches this year after letting go Mike Vrabel and his staff last offseason. And there's been a lot of exciting things on both sides of the ball, but I think that because of red zone and because of just how the game is shaped, we pay more attention to the offense. And so I think people should have a general idea of what the Titans offense looks like, especially now that we're entering week 14 of the season. But the Titans defense is a little bit more of a question mark kind of, because they rank number 1 in passing defense by a couple of different stats. They're pretty much a top 5 passing defense by any stat that you look at. And that's despite not really having a ton of talent, especially when you look at the back end. The front 7 of Tennessee's defense is one of the best in the NFL, but the back 7, or the back 4, I guess, even with L'Jarius Sneed added via trade in the offseason, was still a little bit shaky coming into the season. But now defensive coordinator Zachary Orr, who came over from the Ravens, has done an awesome job. And so
Denard Wilson, Zach Orr was with the Ravens.
Sorry, yeah, I said it.
We are going to talk about Zach Orr, though, because we are going to relate this back to that Ravens trade. So I know where your head's at, because I've got some Zach Orr stats here too.
So honestly, for me, Mia, it was pretty tough to figure out just how this defense is doing what they're doing. Like, obviously, they're a well-coached unit that receives good communication and communicates well amongst each other, just like typical things that you see from good defenses. But what were you able to find in terms of just specific reason for why this defense is clicking in year 1 under Wilson?
Yeah, I'm going to go to this tweet that I found from @TitansStats, LOL, on Twitter. Nice. It's not actually a stat. This was the Titans secondary week 1, the opener of their season. L'Jarius Sneed, Chidobe Awuzie, Roger McCreary, Amani Hooker, Quandre Diggs. Not necessarily the biggest names in the National Football League when it comes to defensive backs, but certainly names you've heard before. This was their starting secondary week 12. The rookie Jarvis Brownlee out of Louisville, Darrell Baker, Roger McCreary, Mike Brown, and Daryl Worley. And prior to getting absolutely shellacked and having 42 hung on them by Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders in a game that I believe, Gus, was simply regression to the mean. And ultimately, Cliff Kingsbury needed to make a statement and showcase that all those stats that our friend Taylor Dahl has been running with, that he regresses, his offenses regress in the second halves of seasons, whether it's college or the National Football League. He just needed to have one of those games. And so I almost throw the Titans' performance last week out the window. I know Brian Boldinger of the NFL Network certainly did. I was watching his cut up, and he said the lack of effort that you saw last week for that Titans defense, was not the Titans defense you saw the first 12 weeks of the NFL season. I think a lot of that was because they got down 21-0 basically from the jump. And while Will Levis has looked better in the month of November, they were getting no help from their offense.
Yeah.
And so I almost throw last week's performance for the Tennessee Titans out the window. And so that's why I do want to focus on that comparison between week 1 to week 12. They have had players in and out of this lineup. L'Jarius Sneed, the marquee trade they made this offseason for a marquee name in the back end. He is on the reserve injured list. And yet here they are still among the top 5 defenses when it comes to passing in the National Football League. Although, look, I mean, they're second in total defense in yards allowed per game behind only the Philadelphia Eagles. And they are giving up 120 yards per game on the ground. But ultimately, that passing defense number is inflating it, yes, but it speaks to the scheme and the message the coordinator is sending. The fact that you could have various names come into the lineup and you're still getting the same result. And that's been impressive. And that's why today what we really want to dig into is that scheme of Denard Wilson coming over from Baltimore, because not only did he make a move away from the nest, pun intended, from the Charm City, you also saw Anthony Weaver leave Baltimore to take the defense coordinator job down in Miami with Mike McDaniel. Speaking of Mike Macdonald, he left to become the Seahawks head coach, bringing with him what was the number 1 defense in the National Football League across the board, a historic defense last season for Baltimore. He's now in Seattle. And then the Los Angeles Chargers have Jesse Minter as their defense coordinator, who came with Jim Harbaugh from Michigan, but once upon a time spent a lot of time in Baltimore as well. And so that's why in my preparation for today's podcast, I'd love to get into, and I've kind of broken down, looking at the different coverage schemes for those outfits, for all of these Baltimore Ravens descendants, and in turn looking at it and saying, if we were to hand pick where the Jaguars need to design their next defense, assuming that there will be changes going into 2025 along the defensive side of the ball at the very least, what do they need to do to be a contemporary modern NFL defense?
Yeah, I'm excited to hear what kind of stats you have about the various coverage types and specifically how various they are, because this reminds me of the Legion of Boom back in 2013-ish, 2014, when after Pete Carroll designed an amazing defense that had future Hall of Famers just riddled across the roster like Bobby Wagner and Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas. Even Cam Chancellor was obviously a dog to anyone who watched him. And then you saw Gus Bradley get hired in Jacksonville. You saw a bunch of assistants get hired. Robert Saleh was hired in various places. Dan Quinn, right? A bunch of assistants from that Seattle defensive coaching staff got head coaching opportunities because Pete Carroll's cover 3 scheme was just working that well. And so that's kind of what you're seeing right now, is that Mike Macdonald's scheme last year in Baltimore, really the past 2 years in Baltimore, was working so well that now like the Ravens kind of have just like a brain dump where they had so many assistants leaving the building to take just opportunities elsewhere. And so I think it's interesting because that's obviously a big similarity of just put a lot of assistants leaving one organization to try to spread their defensive system around the league. But I think what's different in this stance is that Mike Macdonald's scheme is a little bit more versatile and a little bit more adaptive, whereas like the cover 3 was kind of like the beauty of it is, especially for anyone who like remembers Gus Bradley's defenses in Jacksonville, is like you line up and you kind of do what you do. And like the beauty of it is that it's like simplified for the defense and they're able to play very fast. But eventually offenses were able to kind of figure out what worked and what didn't work against that scheme. But it's a lot easier said than done, I think, against Mike Macdonald's Raven scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Gus's scheme, it ultimately became, hey, this is who we are. It's pretty, it's not static, or it is static, pre and post snap. We're just going to line up. We're going to play you straight up. And whatever it is, we'll take it as it comes, whether that's taking everything that's underneath, as we've seen the Jacksonville Jaguars do on offense each of the past 3 seasons against Gus Bradley's defense in Indianapolis, or quite simply just relying on pass rushers and just bringing 4, because in Seattle, you had the luxury of having those marquee names who you could get home with 4 just by virtue of the talent of those players. And when you don't have that talent, are you able to actually operate that scheme? So that's very 2013. I know we've previously talked on the pod about Doug Peterson and his offensive scheme kind of resting its hat on, you know what? This worked in 2017. It'll work in 2024. And I think we can make the same argument on the defensive side of the ball that what previously worked on defense in the National Football League in 2013 and 2017, it may not work here in 2024. So that's what we're here to do today. Let's run through the splits first for the Tennessee Titans. Cover 0, aka all-out blitz. 5.9% of the time, the Tennessee Titans under Denard Wilson go cover 0. 20.1% of the time, they go cover 1. 7.9% of the time, they go cover 2. That's 26th in the NFL. 24.8% of the time, they go cover 3. As I'm going through this, I'm like, wow, why are they in the bottom of the league in every single coverage? I mean, that certainly speaks to diversity and having a diverse array of coverages. And then I got to quarters coverage, 22.8% of the time. That is first in the National Football League. Cover 6, 10.6% of the time. That is ninth in the National Football League. And so they're mixing coverages. But again, it speaks to two different schemes that, while certainly our friend Coach Campo, who's been on this podcast a time or two before, is considered one of the godfathers of quarters coverage, and that was in the early 90s with the Dallas Cowboys that they brought from Miami once upon a time at the collegiate level to the National Football League. Quarter, cover 6, not necessarily the bread and butter of most of these mainstay defense coordinators in the National Football League. Again, it speaks to you can play that when you have – number one, you would assume you can play that when you have a deep group of defensive backs, because it is requiring you to bring more guys into that secondary. And that's what's so fascinating is I go back to what I said off the top. This is a Titans team that has had to shuffle its lineup because of injuries, and yet they're still able to say, this is the defensive scheme we want to play. We can have exotic coverages. It doesn't matter what the name on the back of the jersey is, because our communication is so great from the top on down that we can still run the defense we want to run, which of course is fascinating when you pair it with Jacksonville and the defense the aggressive attacking defense that Ryan Nielsen said he wanted to run. And the fact that the Jaguars have largely had to go away from that man coverage scheme solely because they don't have the horses for the course.
Mm-hmm. So the way I think of cover 6 is like a change-up, because in cover 4, that's basically like 4 secondary players, like just forming a back line and not allowing any explosive plays. And then cover 6 is where you have quarter, half. And so it's basically 3 players deep. And so to me, that's kind of like a change up off of cover 4 that's used like more so depending on what the offense is charting at and their personnel or like how they're lining up. But either way, both of those, and it sounds like for the most part, Tennessee's defense is like a lot of at least 2 high safety coverages, if not 3 or 4 high. But really a lot of 2 high safety coverages, and with the point being to keep everything in front of them. A lot of zone coverage too, as opposed to man. And so they want to just be able to keep everything in front of them, especially on early downs, I think. And then when it comes to 3rd and 4th downs, like then they'll get a little bit more exotic to go with like maybe some cover 0 blitzes. I think like a big buzzword from this coaching tree is sim pressures or simulated pressures, which means like they'll have blitzers that aren't blitzing right away. And so hypothetically, you'll have like 5 defensive players on the line of scrimmage, and 2 of them will drop off as 2 like off-ball defenders who didn't really seem like threats to blitz then come up. And so it kind of sounds silly where it's like, oh, it probably takes a long time for those like 2 defenders to come blitz from off the ball and from like not really looking like a true threat to blitz. But it really works a lot because it's just not what quarterbacks are expecting. And I think that's really the name of the scheme, or the name of the game with the scheme, is that it's just throws quarterbacks off, especially with just like changing the picture post snap. Because I think that while like even if a quarterback could pull up the same stats that you did and say, okay, I know that these are the coverages I'm going to get. Mike Macdonald did a great job of this, but really all of his assistants this year have done a good job of switching up the picture post snap. And I think that like the Titans have played Josh Allen, CJ Stroud, Jaden Daniels obviously did well against them, Justin Herbert and Jared Goff. So it's not like they've played like no good quarterbacks this year. I thought that was one thing that I looked into as to why they're performing so well statistically. But I think that they are able to take advantage of the 4 quarterbacks that they play because of how much post-snap movement they have with the safeties, whether they're switching from like cover 2 to cover 3, and then also the movement up front in terms of who's coming after me. Because as we've seen with like Brian Flores, even though it's a different scheme, it's kind of a good example of just how much pressure they can put on quarterbacks and how much thinking they kind of have to do after the snap.
And one good point from our friend Doug Peterson yesterday in his press conference was that part of why this is the number one passing defense in the NFL is because they can get home with 4, because they do have 4 mutants along that defensive front. The fact that they have Jeffrey Simmons and Tavondre Sweat and they're in the middle of the pack in run defense is almost surprising to me, Gus, because that's perhaps the most beef you'll find in the interior of a defensive line that can also generate a pass rush. What's interesting when it comes to that pass rush is that almost entirely, I would argue, and this is where, again, it speaks to outside of L'Jarius Sneed and maybe Amani Hooker, who are the marquee names in the back end for this Titans defense. Almost all of their sacks this season have come from that front 4, a little bit from the linebacking core. The only defensive back with a sack this year is Roger McCreary. He has 1. Now, when you pivot to tackles for loss, McCreary has 11 tackles for loss. And so certainly a couple nickel blitzes here and there. Again, we alluded to the cover 0 numbers off the top and just the amount of blitzing that the Titans do comparatively to the Jaguars, 2.2% of the time. And then Jarvis Brownlee, the rookie out of Louisville, who really didn't start seeing a large amount of the playing time until probably like week 7, week 8. So coming up on the midway point of the season, he has 5 tackles for loss. Amani Hooker has 4 tackles for loss. I can tell you this, that's outside of Monteric Brown, who loves to crowd the line of scrimmage, and perhaps Andre Sisco, who at least when he was coming out of Syracuse, we were told that he was a guy that would have no issue laying down the law at the line of scrimmage.
His college tape was crazy.
Right. That's significantly more blitzing and more getting in the backfield from your defensive backs than you see right now in Jacksonville. And at the same time, that's without marquee names. That's without Marlon Humphrey at your nickel corner spot. Not that Roger McCreary, no offense, he's Roger McCreary compared to Marlon Humphrey. That's not even a conversation. The point being is that they are getting home and they are generating the bulk of their pressure with their guys on the front 4, which says to me, and I'm not sure how much cap space the Titans have this offseason, but imagine if they actually could be like the Seattle Seahawks, be like the Baltimore Ravens last year, and have Pro Bowl caliber names in the back ends. Look at what they're doing right now. That's impressive to me.
Yeah, I think it all starts with the front. And I think that the reason that they're so successful is that they have such a good front that they're able to dictate more resources to the back end. I think they rank 6th in percentage of light box this year, according to SIS on defense. And so that means they have just a lot more bodies in the secondary trying to protect the pass. And so, especially when you have guys like Jeffrey Simmons, who's been one of the best defensive tackles in the league since he entered in 2019, and then rookie Tavondre Sweat, who had a crazy draft process. Like he was like overweight at a couple of different spots along the way. I think he
refused to weigh in at different junctures along his pre-draft process.
I think he might have gotten like speeding violation, or DUI. So like he was on his way to being like one of the biggest fallers in the draft and like maybe one of just the biggest busts in the draft period. But he's had put together an amazing rookie season, and he is like just a prototypical nose tackle in the same way that like Jordan Davis is for the Eagles, who's a first-round pick a couple of years ago. And the reason that the Eagles picked Jordan Davis in the first round is that he's able to eat up so much space in the inside gaps by himself that the Eagles can then dictate more resources to the back. And so you've seen the same thing in Tennessee. And honestly, you saw similar stuff with Baltimore in recent years too, because they've got Justin Matabuke, they've got Michael Pierce. They've got a really loaded defensive line, but specifically in the interior. And so I think that that's gone a long way. Even in Miami, they've got a kid named Zach Sealer, who's a really underrated defensive tackle. Obviously, they've got the mayor, Calais Campbell, down there. And so I think that's a big part of this scheme is making sure that you're good enough on the defensive line, but specifically the interior defensive line, so that you can only have like 4 guys lining up for the most part and even rushing for the most part and still be able to do what you need to do in the trenches. And so that's really big. I feel like that's another thing the Jaguars haven't really been able to do. I totally agree with your point where like aggressiveness can kind of be coached into players or like into the scheme to allow players to be more aggressive. And I feel like we haven't seen a lot of that in Jacksonville, but we also haven't just seen them winning enough with their front 4, even with the twin towers of Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines Allen being dominant as they have been this entire season. like they're not quite good enough in the front yet to be able to have more resources, go to the back end.
My one note on Matabike, who of course changed his name this offseason to his actual birth name as opposed to going by Justin. My one note on Matabike, who had just 3 sacks, and I think it was like 17 total pressures going into the week 9 meeting, I want to say it was, with the Bengals before he erupted for 3 sacks in that game. Is there something to be said that when you change your name in the offseason, you take a step back at the very least in the stat department? I'm just saying.
He was also in a contract year. I think you take a step back.
I know someone else who was in a contract year and also changed his name and has been a great player, and you have been the number 1 defender of Josh Hines-Allen and his statistical performance here in 2024. And I agree with you. A lot of the Jaguars' success, which hasn't been a whole heck of a lot, is due in part to Josh Hines-Allen and what he is able to do, not just in generating a pass rush and creating opportunities for other players to get home, but also in his run defense, which is also significantly improved this season. So that's a side tangent for another time. Speaking of the Jaguars, though, a couple different case studies I want to do before we get out of here. So I ran through the Titans' different coverage schemes, right? So my question was, how is that different than Mike Vrabel, a name that not only is the apple of many eyes this upcoming NFL offseason during the coaching carousel season, but also is a guy who's widely respected as a defensive-minded head coach. And so comparatively to last year, the cover 0 number is certainly up. They're blitzing more than they did under Mike Vrabel. The cover 1 number is also up, which I found interesting, from 17.3% of the time last season. A number that has dropped is the amount of cover 2 that the Titans run. They ran 12.1% of the time cover 2 last year compared to 7.9% this year. This is where it got really interesting for me, because not only am I comparing Vrabel's Titans with Denard Wilson's Titans, but also then looking at those other Ravens tree and the amount of time that they run cover 3, quarters, and cover 6. So last year, Mike Vrabel's Titans ran cover 3 29.4% of the time. The Titans this year, 24.8% of the time. That's 26th in the National Football League. By the way, the Titans, Ravens, Dolphins, Chargers, Seahawks, all from that same tree, they're all literally, if you look at the rankings of how much teams run cover 3, it's like 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, and 26th in the National Football League. So they're all in that middle of the pack, in the 20s, though. So it's not like they're running the most cover 3 of anybody. Shocker, Gus Bradley and the Colts run the most cover 3. I know you're also surprised by that fact. Quarters. Last year, Mike Vrabel ran quarters the 5th most of any defense in the National Football League. This year, as we alluded to, yes, it's 1st in the National Football League. And then finally, they ran cover 6, 3.4% of the time last year, which was 29th in the National Football League. They're 9th this year with 10.6% of the time. But what that says to me, while there has been roster turnover, we know that defensive front outside of the addition of Tavondre Sweat is largely the same. Roger McCreary was there last year. Amani Hooker was there last year. And so that's what I found most interesting is, yes, there's been some personnel changes with Brian Callahan becoming the head coach and a new DC coming in. But the fact that these numbers were not as jarring as what I saw between the Brandon Staley Chargers and the Jesse Minter Chargers was very, very fascinating to me.
Yeah, the biggest thing that stuck out to me is just the cover 3 usages, how obviously Gus Bradley's at the top still with the Legion of Doom and all of their staff is still up there.
Make 2013 great again. I see Pat in the chat wants to talk about running the ball great again. Make 2013 defense great again. Gus ain't going to change. Gus is not going to change.
This new like coaching staff, or Mike Macdonald's tree rather, is like anti-cover 3 because really it's not that they're anti-cover 3, I think, but it's they're anti having one player in the middle of the field. And that's like a big reason why Pete Carroll's defenses in Seattle work so well, is that they had one defender over the middle of the field, and that guy was Earl Thomas, who's the best center fielder since Ed Reed. So
I was going to say, like, top 5 all time.
Yeah, it's so like a big thing is like with the Legion of Boom and why it's kind of like it's mostly failed when coaches try to take it other places is just that like it's a simplified scheme and it doesn't work unless you have just outrageous talent to execute it. And so that's part of the reason that Gus Bradley's defense worked so well in 2017 is that with Jalen Ramsey and Calais Campbell and all these guys who were like in their primes, it worked out really well because they had a lot of talent. But you can't really rely on talent to win in the league, especially on defense, especially with like how good quarterbacks are nowadays and how the rules are kind of bent a little bit to favor offenses. You can't just rely on defensive talent. And so I think that these new coaches under Mike McDaniel realized that we don't have an Earl Thomas, even though the Ravens did have Kyle Hamilton last year, who can do literally anything you want on a football field from a defensive standpoint. Rather than have him be their center fielder, they were like using him as a chess weapon pretty much, or a mismatch weapon up in the box. Really, he was pretty much their main slot corner, even though Marlon Humphrey has been in that role for a long time. But Hamilton was playing a lot in the slot. And so basically they're like, we're not playing with just one guy over the middle of the field because that's just too much to ask for 99% of NFL players, which is saying a lot. Like even Andre Cisco, we had high expectations for him going into this year. And I think he's one of only a few players who actually can have that role. But even still, like we've seen that he's like okay. He's been okay at best in that role as a center fielder for the Jags. And so I think partly because of that, but then mostly just because you want 2+ safeties deep in order to take away explosive plays. You'd rather have more bodies back there as opposed to just one Earl Thomas or one Kyle Hamilton or one Andre Cisco. And so I think in general, it's less about cover 3 and more about just not relying on one guy to break up deep passes. You want to dictate or have more bodies, more resources in the back end, and then have a bunch of people kind of be back and come up to rally to the football and have everything in front of them rather than getting burnt and watching a ball go over your head.
Which, by the way, the Ravens have had to adjust their defense under Zach Orr this season after Mike Macdonald's departure. And in large part, it's because they've struggled with communication and zone coverage. And I don't know if that's a byproduct of a new defensive play caller in Zach Orr, who's a first-year DC, and not having Mike Macdonald, but it's largely the same personnel. And so to your point, Kyle Hamilton has had to move to more of a true safety role with Ardarius Washington opposite him and Marlon Humphrey solely in the slot, because it feels like, and at least in my preliminary research of the Ravens for today's podcast about the Titans, who of course are a descendant of that tree, it sounds like they're just getting killed in zone on deep plays because there's no communication and because they were trying to move guys around like chess pieces, and it just wasn't working under Zach Orr, which is fascinating again because largely the same players as last year, but a different defensive play caller, which I found interesting. I do want to note, Gus, because as I've done a time or two on this pod, I spent a whole monologue on it on Helmets and Heels earlier this week. I am fascinated by what the Los Angeles Chargers have done over the past 365 days since they said goodbye to Brandon Staley and welcomed in the Jim Harbaugh era. And the fact that they were able to keep largely, outside of the 2 marquee wide receivers, they were largely able to keep that roster intact despite the fact, and I know Austin Eckler too. Shout out Austin Eckler. I know he's on IR right now. Despite the fact that they were up against it on the salary cap, they were able to keep Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Derwin James. The list goes on. Here are the differences between Brandon Staley, a Vic Fangio disciple, between his splits last year as the DC and what we're seeing Jesse Minter, a disciple of the Baltimore tree, running in Los Angeles. Last year, I'll go to the highlights for you because the largely cover 1 is down from 14.3% to 8.8%, which is 31st in the National Football League. The other numbers are kind of similar. Cover 3. Brandon Staley last year ran cover 3 21.8% of the time. This year, it's actually 31% of the time from Jesse Minter, which is up. I thought that was very interesting. Then when it comes to quarters, last year under Brandon Staley, the Chargers ran quarters 10.4% of the time. They now run at 22.7% of the time. This is interesting, though. Last year, they ran cover 6, 24.4% of the time. That number is actually down to 11.7, although that's in the middle of the pack in the National Football League. I found that actually, no, it's 5th in the National Football League. So I found that very, very interesting that he ran it almost like to prove a point, to say I'm modern, I'm exotic, here I am, look at me with diverse coverages. But yet here we are with this Jesse Minter defense that's finding such success. And maybe it's the whole National Football League that's just down. I'm not sure about that. But I did find the quarters coverage jump very interesting because, again, that's largely the same personnel grouping, which, as we said, perhaps that's the underlying storyline in Tennessee, is that they have changed the personnel set, but not too much. But when you look at the coverage schemes, it's changed, but only slightly altered from what Mike Vrabel was running.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the biggest difference, excuse me, in LA, at least on the defensive side, is like how well they're coached, because that's been the biggest
thing. It's about communication, and it's about discipline.
We've seen this from Buffalo for years now. Sean McDermott's defense has been one of the best in the league for years, because like they have had a lot of talent, but really because their communication in the back end is outrageously good. Anytime you watch a Bills game, just like the amount of communication that all their secondary players have is really outstanding. Vic Fangio's Eagles this year, like I think that if they win the Super Bowl, it's going to be because of Vic Fangio. Like the difference from last year to this year in terms of just how well they're communicating. Obviously, getting rookies Cooper DeJean and Quinion Mitchell in there is a big talent boost, but at the same time, like getting them in there and to be instant contributors, and specifically DeJean to be working out of the slot and have so many different responsibilities, as opposed to like Quinion Mitchell's job is hard, but it's a little bit simplified because he's basically just following receivers around or sticking to one side. But either way, they both had really impressive rookie seasons, in a large part because of Fangio and how well coached they are. And like the Eagles Jaguars game from week 9 or whatever it was, that was like the wildest film I've seen all season, because like at this point, like most teams kind of know what Doug Peterson's offense is. They're able to stop most of
it's kind of like Gus Bradley's defense. We know what it is, and it's been the same for years.
Fangio was like just a whole nother level above every other defense that the Jags have faced this year. He just like knew everything that was coming. And so I think it's a little bit of the same in LA, where it's like just the year-to-year difference in terms of communication and coaching in the secondary especially has been wild. I think that like the Chargers are probably, I would say from what I've seen, like the second best coached defense in the league behind Vic Fangio's Eagles, based on just how seamless they are in coverage.
Right. And that, of course, raises the point of our final point here on today's podcast, because I know I got a jet, but the 2024 Jaguars, they run cover 1, the second most in the National Football League. They run cover 2, the first most in the National Football League. They are dead last in cover 3. And so predictability. I think that we've just run through for you guys a bunch of different defensive coverages. And you're probably, if you know, you're like, man, they're throwing out too many numbers at me. Know this: the Jaguars are primarily running 2 different coverage schemes in 2024. That's predictable. And one of the hallmarks of this Ravens defense, and what I know I'd love to see from a future Jaguars defense, is diverse fronts, not being static pre and post snap, disguising things. The Jaguars haven't done it under Ryan Nielsen. They really didn't do it under Mike Caldwell. They didn't even do that under Joe Cullen in 2021. I would love to see finally something from a defense that says, hey, that is attacking and that is exotic.
Totally. Every once in a while, I would see like an inverted Tampa 2 out of Mike Caldwell, and I'd say, Eureka, this is amazing. But I'm right there with you. Honestly, on both sides of the ball, there's not enough creativity.
Motion.
Motion. What you're saying in terms of just putting the opposite side of the ball in a bind right before or right after the snap by just changing the picture. I think that's definitely the big lesson we can take away from the Ravens defensive coaching tree.
Absolutely.
You got anything else you want to give it? Maybe a score prediction for Sunday's game before we get out of here?
I think it's good. I'd bet the under. I'll tell you that much. And that's even with Will Levis taking a step forward, which we didn't even discuss on today's podcast. I'd probably say something in the ballpark of Jaguars 15, Titans 20. Honestly, like that's what I'm looking at. And I heard, having gone on a couple different Nashville radio stations yesterday, it's going to be rainy and cold up there. They have struggled against mobile quarterbacks. The Tennessee Titans have. Mac Jones is not all that mobile. So 20 to 15. How does that sound? Some more scoregami here in Duval.
Yeah, you love your scoregami.
I love my scoregami. Well, especially because Doug Peterson is addicted to going for 2.
True. No, that's fair. If for anyone who didn't hear, Trevor Lawrence was placed on injured reserve yesterday, which is officially the end of his season. And so Mac Jones will be starting not just this week, but through the rest of the year for the Jaguars. And so, yeah, with Mac Jones at the helm, I do not have a lot of confidence in the Jaguars team, for sure, but especially this offense. I think they're going to score 6 points and then like maybe get a garbage time touchdown late. So I'll say Jaguars 13, Titans 24. I don't think it's
But hey, listen, we're still here. Duval Rundown continues, and that's why we enjoy not only breaking down the upcoming opponent for the Jaguars over the next 5 weeks of the season, Gus, but how does it relate to maybe where this team should be moving into 2025?
That's right. We're just basically getting our Christmas wish list done early. All right, everyone. That's me, O'Brien. I'm Gus Logue. Thanks to everyone for joining. We will be back on Sunday to break down the Titans' first Jaguars game. Mia and Tommy McManus and Hacker will be joining. So until then, thanks everyone for tuning in.